for Russia, this is an existential threat. The possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is simply unacceptable to the Russians. And they are not going to stop until Ukraine and the West are defeated and they both accept the fact that Ukraine has to be a neutral state, number one, and it has to be disarmed to the point where it's not an offensive threat to Russia. Until you get to that point, or until you accept that point in the West, all this talk about generous terms makes no sense at all. So Rubio is, he's like a ship passing in the night with the Russians. They just, these are two sets of people who are just operating on very different planets. The Russians have demands that Rubio is simply unwilling to meet. And given that, the war is going to be settled on the battlefield, period. End of story.
That point was made by Dmitry Peskov because he said, but he was asked, what does Russia think about these claims? He didn't sound like he was particularly frustrated, but then zeroed back around to the root causes.
President Trump's statements were made after communicating with Zelensky and, apparently, under the influence of the vision that Zelensky had laid out. This vision is completely contrary to our understanding of the current situation, but at the same time, we will also have the opportunity to bring our position to the American side. As for these specific statements, there is an obvious situation in the Russian economy which more than eloquently says that despite all the illegal sanctions, our economy absolutely retains its stability and predictability. The war is not aimless. The war is to ensure our security and our interests and eliminate the root cause of the conflict that exists between Russia and Ukraine, and which, in fact, exists in the field of European security in general.
Well, if there's anything on the Russian side, they are monotonous and relentless on saying the same thing year after year about what's important. So one wonders, will the message ever actually get through?
I think the answer is no. I mean, I like your rhetoric year after year. It's not month after month or week after week. It's year after year. In fact, Danny, before the war started, the Russians made it clear what their demands were. And since the war started in February of 2022, they have repeated their position ad nauseum. And it was most clearly laid out last June 14th. This is June 14th, 2024. And what Putin said then was hardly different from what he said before June 14th. And it's hardly different from what's been said since. And his lieutenants say the same thing over and over. But the West simply refuses to acknowledge what Russia's position is. And as long as that is the case, and people in Ukraine and people in the West continue to demand that the Russians accept certain provisions of an agreement that the Russians categorically reject, you're not going to get an agreement. And as we've said ad nauseum, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just don't see any evidence that anything is going to compel the Russians to give up their deeply held, emotionally held red lines about how this thing has to end because of the root causes, because of all the causes, et cetera. Or at least you would think that's the case, because it doesn't seem to be getting through. When you talk about lieutenants, just look at the U.S. side here for a minute, because now you can tell me here, there's a couple of sound bites I want to show you here from some of our side, and this may be intended for a domestic audience, because I worry if it's not for a domestic audience, if it's because we actually think this, then we have a bigger problem than I may think. Here, first of all, is Caroline Levitt talking about how frustrated President Trump has been.
He's been incredibly frustrated with President Putin and Russia, who continue to talk nice, but then we wake up every morning and in the West Wing, we're receiving reports about how Russia bombed Ukraine and they continue to kill innocent civilians. And the president is making it very clear that Russia is in a very weak position. And he's absolutely right. They are a massive country with a massive military. They are a war economy. But it's been 3.5 years. And look at how Ukraine has been able to defend itself. And so the president has said that we are going to continue selling weapons to NATO, and NATO and Ukraine can choose how to use those weapons. But the way that this weapon arrangement has now taken place under President Trump is putting America first, because we are selling these weapons to Ukraine and to NATO, and NATO is backfilling those weapons to Ukraine. So the American taxpayer is benefiting from this. That's a change and a shift in position from the Biden administration. But the president has said if Vladimir Putin wants to keep fighting, well, the president knows how to fight.
The president knows how to fight? I mean, let's start there. What the hell does that mean?
Well, very importantly, Danny, she said, and I'm sure it's true, that Trump is greatly frustrated that he has not been able to get a peace agreement, because he said that he would do that even before he got in the White House and shortly after, if he didn't get it beforehand. So I'm sure he's frustrated. And maybe he thought after the meeting in Alaska that it would be possible to get some sort of deal. So I can understand that. But you want to listen to what she said that Trump was going to do. And she basically repeated what is in the Truth Social post that we talked about at the outset of the show. She said that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are in charge. She basically said that President Trump is passing the buck to them. And furthermore, she emphasized that the Europeans are going to pay for the weaponry. We're not paying for the weaponry. This is America first. And that's completely consistent with what I said at the start of the show. And it's just more evidence that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine war. And at the same time, he's going to great lengths to protect himself when Ukraine loses.
And what do you make of the repeating there about, hey, Russia? She didn't use the term paper tiger there, but she implied it by saying, hey, you know, Russia's been fighting for 3.5 years, and something that see, I think it was General Petraeus said a couple of days ago, or a few weeks rather, that no, it was Kellogg. That's right. Keith Kellogg said that Russia actually is losing because if it was winning, it would have already taken Kiev by now. So the fact that they've only taken in the last 2 years or so 1% more additional territory, that's somehow evidence that they're losing. I don't know. But if they're losing and we're going to give this weaponry for some period of time, but Russia doesn't lose, how do they worry about that? Or how do they square that one?
Don't ask me. I have no idea. I'll tell you one thing, though, for those people who think Russia's a paper tiger, and there appear to be a number of people who are thinking in those terms these days, I think that what we ought to do is fly them over to Kyiv, put them in a uniform, put them on a truck, and then send them up to the front lines. Now, according to the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, it's not clear they'll get to the front lines because that paper tiger is now tearing apart the lines of communication. And it's very hard for the Ukrainians to get troops from the rear up to the forward edge of the battle area. But let's assume that they get up there. Let them spend a couple weeks fighting against the Russians. And if they're still alive after a couple weeks, they can tell us whether or not they think the Russians are a paper tiger or not. My guess is that those who survive that scenario will tell us very clearly that the Russians are not a paper tiger, and that the Ukrainians are at a great disadvantage and have their hands full dealing with this massively armed steamroller that's coming at them.
Now, I may be asking you to speculate on something that you can't get inside the head of the Russians anyway to figure out, or even in the White House for that matter. But as best you can interpret from the signals that you get from multiple sources, it almost looks to me like Trump, with this boisterous Truth Social post, and then the consequent actions that he is going to continue selling, apparently at the rate of $1 billion per month, at least for 10 months is the number I've seen bandied about so far. It sounds like he's just saying, this thing's not going to go on. So at least I'm going to benefit from it. So we're not going to do anything to bring it to an end. We're definitely not going to pressure the Ukraine side, which is the one area he does have some leverage, I think. But instead, it's like, we'll just sit back and make some money in between now and then, and probably just, make some more true socials over the months and just kind of keep it going. Do you see it any differently?
No, I would just add that he's got to protect himself so that he doesn't get blamed when Ukraine loses. And he is doing that, as I explained before. And in the process, he's making money. I mean, this is a disastrous situation for the Ukrainians, as you and I have been arguing for a long time. And as you and I argued a year ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, you and I were a tag team, of course, saying that it was ridiculous to continue this war because Ukraine is just going to lose more territory and more Ukrainians will die. We've been making this argument until we're blue in the face, but nobody listens and they continue to fight. And again, President Trump telling the Ukrainians that they can capture all that territory that they lost, if anything, just encourages the Ukrainians and the Europeans to pursue this foolish policy of continuing to fight the Russians and not stopping the war, which would be in Ukraine's best interest. So as you watch this war evolve and you watch both Ukrainian and Western behavior, it more or less makes you sick to your stomach when you think of what's happening to Ukraine.
Now, let me ask you a separate question here. Let's look at it from the perspective of Ukraine for a moment. So Zelensky, I think, correctly interpreted based on his Fox News interview, which we showed you part of a minute ago. But from the position of the Ukrainian armed forces, so those guys are sitting out there at the front. You just mentioned that Wall Street Journal piece talked about how difficult life is at the front just to get to the front, much less to survive and continue to take some actions. And as a matter of fact, over the past about 36 hours or so, according to reports I got just before we came on the air, Ukraine has apparently a fairly successful counterattack going on north of Peskov right now, which in a local area might be able to actually cut off a piece of the Russian advance here. That's on top of a lot of other areas where Russia continues to make its own advances. So in larger terms, it's a small thing, but it'll give them a momentary, I guess, feel-good thing, especially if they're able to pinch that thing off. But the bigger issue for the troops themselves, they see what the life is like there, and then they heard no new weapons, nothing in any size anyway, no new sanctions. So it's like basically you guys are on your own with the Ukraine or with the Europeans, but that hasn't turned into much in terms of actual combat capacity. What is that going to do to your will to continue fighting when you don't see anything new on the horizon?
Well, I think it can't help but erode their will. The question is how much and how fast. I'm actually surprised, as I've said before, that the Ukrainians have continued to fight as ferociously as they have up to this point. There's no question that they have a huge problem recruiting people to go to the front lines. The number of draft dodgers is enormous. And furthermore, they have a significant desertion problem.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the forces that they do have on the front line, who General Syrski himself says are outnumbered 3-1 overall and 6-1. Just think about that, outnumbered 6-1 at certain critical points along the front line. And nevertheless, the Ukrainians continue to fight like wild dogs. In a certain sense, it's truly impressive. It shows you the power of nationalism. And they've gone on longer than I thought would be the case. But at some point, I do believe that the front lines will break because you can't sustain this forever. I'd also note, Danny, when they talk about these Ukrainian counterattacks and they talk about the Ukrainians moving all sorts of forces from other areas to the Pokrovsk region and then launching counterattacks. Counterattacks are offensive operations. You're out in the open. And as all the news stories on what the battlefield looks like tell us, when you're out in the open, you're exposed and you're likely to die. So I would imagine these counterattacks are resulting in significant Ukrainian casualties. And furthermore, what's happening here is that, they may move forces to the Pokrovsk area and they may slow things down there in terms of the Russian advances. But the problem is they weaken themselves on along other positions on the battlefield. And the Russians have a huge enough force advantage that they then take advantage of the Ukrainians in locations where they have shifted forces away from that particular area to the Pokrovsk area.
Well, in fact, as a matter of fact, that is exactly the dynamic taking place right now, because a little over a month ago, when Ukraine moved some of the reinforcements from one part of the battlefield, the Liman area, over to help the Pokrovsk area, which is where now those troops are doing this counterattack. Now then, with that combat power withdrawn, now Russia did immediately start taking advantage of that, and they have made some significant and more rapid advances in the Liman area, which is, of course, very important in the Donetsk area. So that is playing out exactly as you suggested.
Yeah, I mean, again, General Syrskyi says that the Ukrainians are outnumbered 3-1, and some people are arguing that the overall number is even bigger than that. That the number 700,000, which is given for the number of Russian forces up inside of Ukraine, the number is actually higher than 700,000. But anyway, Syrskyi says the Russians have a 3-1 advantage overall, and at critical points, they have a 6-1 advantage. You just want to think about that. That's a huge advantage. And then we talked about the Wall Street Journal that talked about how Russian drones are making it almost impossible for Ukraine to move troops up to the front line. And then you start talking about just the overall balance in the drone war. It's quite clear it shifted significantly in favor of the Russians over the Ukrainians. Early in the war, the Ukrainians had the advantage in terms of drones. Now the Russians have a clear advantage. If you look at artillery and other pieces of weaponry, the Russians have a significant advantage. Very important. If you look at glide bombs, right? Yeah. The Russians have a huge inventory of glide bombs, which they use liberally against fixed positions on the Ukrainian side of the line. And the Ukrainians admit, if you read the newspapers carefully, that these glide bombs are devastating. How many glide bombs do the Ukrainians have? 0. Then when you go to air defenses, we read about all these air attacks involving missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, deep into Ukraine. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians don't have the capability to shoot these missiles and drones down, and that the Russians are pounding the industrial base inside of Ukraine. Ukraine has been making an effort to develop weapons of its own, to develop its own industrial base so that it can fight the war better. Fully understandable. But the Russians have good intelligence. They know where those industrial locations are, or those industries are. And when they're ready to open up and start producing weapons, the Russians attack. And therefore, the Ukrainians don't have much of an industrial base. The West doesn't have much of an industrial base. So the Ukrainians they're badly outnumbered at every turn. And then we were talking before about, desertions and the fact that they can't recruit people in large numbers to replace those who are killed. They're doomed.
I want to take a look at something else here that was also in the news the last several days. And that is, we're going to go first of all to Lindsey Graham, because he was suggesting, he was grinning ear to ear, first of all, because he's been wanting all these big sanctions, which is odd to me because he didn't get his sanctions at all, and yet he's still eager. And so instead of talking about something that he did get, now he's thinking, hey, maybe we can shoot down some Russian jets.
What should you do if a Russian jet flies into your country? Shoot it down. He's tried to go out of his way to get Putin to the table. We don't want to humiliate Russia. We just want to end the war. And to our friends in Russia, here's what Trump did today. He told NATO, I'll sell you all the weapons you want. You can provide them to Ukraine. And as to Ukraine, you can use them any way you want. So to the Russian military, you're going to be up against the high-end American weapons that will be sold to NATO for the benefit of Ukraine. And this war is coming to your backyard here with no limitations like Biden.
So first of all, there's a lot of limitations compared to Biden, because the last Biden package was $61 billion. This is, for if all 10 months were put together, $10 billion. So it's a whole lot less on its own merit there. But what do you say to his comment there that basically, okay, now Russia, it's going to suck to be you because you're going to go with this high-tech American weaponry when it hasn't done anything over the last 3.5 years?
I mean, he's blowing smoke, right? I mean, first of all, I think there's sort of been 4 big incidents here that people are talking about. One is the drones that went into Poland. 2 is one drone that wandered into Romania and then out. And then there's all this talk about these drones that were near the airports in Oslo and Copenhagen, and Oslo Airport and Copenhagen Airport were shut down as a result. So there's sort of 3 incidents involving drones. And then there's the incident of 3 MiGs that are said to have flown into Estonian airspace. Now, the Russians categorically deny that they flew those MiGs into Estonian airspace. So the Russians have no interest in sending MiGs into NATO territory. And I think the worst case that could be made for the Russian position is that those 3 MiGs went over this small pile of rocks that's about 25 kilometers from the Estonian coastline in the Baltic. The Russians deny that they went over these rocks, which belong to Estonia. But let's assume that they did. It's just not that big a deal. And with regard to the drones, the one drone that went into Romania, is this serious? No. And then the drones in Oslo and Copenhagen, there's no evidence that they're Russian drones. So the only real incident here are, I think, about 19 drones went into Poland. And the Russians did not do this on purpose, according to them. And the Russians have proposed that the West and Russia get together to investigate exactly what happened. That's what the Russians want to do. They want to investigate what happened. They're not denying that those Russian drones wandered into Poland, but they have made it clear that they did not do it on purpose, right? They were not trying to provoke Poland or NATO. And they said, let's examine what happened here. And by the way, these were reconnaissance drones or dummies. They were not, armed drones. But NATO, of course, refused, or the West refused, to try and figure out exactly what happened here. I would also note to you that it appears that of the 19 drones that went into Poland, NATO shot down 3 of them. These are drones, reasonably easy to shoot down. They only shot down 3 of the 19. So not a very good performance. But my bottom line here is I do not believe the Russians are trying to pick a fight with NATO. And if you have an incident, I think it makes the most sense for NATO to make sure it doesn't escalate so that we don't end up in a shooting war with the Russians. That would not be in our interest. It would not be in the Russians' interest. It would not be in anybody's interest. So as long as the Russians are not attacking countries in NATO, we should go to great lengths to make sure that we keep a cap on the volcano. But what's happening here, Danny, as you surely realize, is that NATO forces are taking advantage of every one of these incidents and blowing them out of proportion to make it look like the Russians are up to no good. And what NATO has to do is react furiously and seriously so that the Russians understand we mean business. And this is all designed to solidify NATO and to get the Americans firmly committed to the Ukraine war. These are effectively false flag operations. That's what's going on here. What we're trying to do in countries like Estonia, Latvia, Poland for sure, Ukraine, is figure out a way to drag the Americans in. So if a drone wanders over Romania, and these sorts of things happen in warfare, you and I know that very well. If that happens, the smart thing to do is to deal with it and keep the cap on the volcano.